Good evening. I'm Chuck Ryback, Dean of the College of Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences, and thank you for joining us for the first No Reservations edition of 2022. No Reservations is a conversation series designed to provide a forum for sharing current, challenging, and provocative ideas. We are coming to you live from UW-Green Bay's Fort Howard Hall at the Weidner Center for the Performing Arts, and as always, thank you to Kelly Strickland and Kelly Desjardins and all of their wonderful peeps that support them. Before moving on to the introductions for tonight's speakers, I'd like to read the land acknowledgement. We at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay acknowledge the First Nations people who are the original inhabitants of the region. The Ho-Chunk Nation and the Menominee Nation are the original first people of Wisconsin, and both nations have ancient historical and spiritual connections to the land that our institution now resides upon. Today, Wisconsin is home to 12 First Nations communities, including the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin, Forest County, Potawatomi, Ojibwe Nation communities, Stockbridge-Munsee Community Band of Mohican Indians, and the Brothertown Indian Nation. We acknowledge the First Nations peoples of Wisconsin. I'm really excited to be back and to introduce our speakers for tonight. This will be our second duo on No Reservations. And first, Dr. Julie Case is an assistant professor of English and Humanities at UW-GB, where she teaches courses in creative writing, game writing, and literature. She is a co-director of the UW-GB Center for Games and Interactive Media with Chris Williams and Brian Carr. She writes fiction, creative nonfiction, and digital pieces, and you can find more information about her work at her website. Dr. Chris Williams is an assistant professor of English and Humanities. He teaches classes in poetry, game writing, and the avant-garde. His current research interests include procedurally generated storytelling, aleatoric creative practices, and the intersection between poetry and games. Along with Dr. Julie Case and Dr. Brian Carr, he co-directs the Center for Games and Interactive Media at UW-Green Bay. Professors Case and Williams will give a brief talk titled Phoenix AR, Telling Stories Through Augmented Reality. And then we will move to the question and answer portion. So for those of you out there viewing, please post any questions that you have in the chat, and those will get to me, and I will do my best to work those in. It is my pleasure to introduce Drs. Julie Case and Chris Williams, and up first is Dr. Julie Case.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for coming, and thanks to Chuck and the No Reservation folks for hosting us. I'm so excited to be here. So I thought I would start today's talk by sharing a photo of me with my favorite Pokemon. This is a Dragonite, and in case you're not familiar, a Dragonite is my favorite because it's a dragon, which means that it's automatically really cool, but it's also really goofy and approachable. Tonight, Chris Williams and I are going to talk about augmented reality. We're going to talk about what it is and how it can be used creatively, and we'll also talk about the Phoenix AR project that we'll be working on. But I wanted to start just by acknowledging one of the things that first drew me to AR in the first place as a writer and a storyteller, and that is the potential for breaking down the barriers between the fictional world and the real world, which helps to create narrative experiences that are more immersive, engaging, and interactive than anything we've really encountered before, and that have a really profound implication for art, storytelling, and creative expression. So this is a pretty new field, and I thought I would start by just giving a few definitions. So I think most people are probably familiar with virtual reality. And with virtual reality, the idea is to replace the physical world with a digital replica that feels exactly like the physical world. So usually this is experienced through a VR headset, something like the Facebook Oculus, which completely masks the physical world from you as you're engaging with it. And you move your physical body, and in the virtual world, you feel like you're engaging with that world in the way that you might in the real world. So in the picture on the top here, I have a picture of one of my favorite games, which is Beat Saber. And in this game, you virtually hold two lightsabers, and these blocks come flying at you, and there's music playing, and you have to move in time to the music to slash these these bricks. And as you're doing that in the physical world, you're holding these two controllers that vibrate, and so there's this haptic sensation of actually slashing the bricks, and these walls are coming towards you, and I have to kind of dodge them, and there's spikes. So it's a really physical experience, even though you're in a completely digital world. It's a lot of fun, and it's something I highly recommend to everyone watching. In augmented reality, you have a lot of similar elements to VR. So you still have digital elements, you have things like sound and audio, but these elements don't replace the physical world. Instead, they augment it. So that means that you can be in your living room, and you can still see your living room, but you might have a Dragonite in your living room. So there are companies like Apple that are developing wearable technology that allow you to engage with AR seamlessly. But for most of us, AR is experienced through everyday technology like our phones or our tablets. So you lift up your phone, you look through your phone, and you see a Dragonite in your living room. You can use the screen on your phone to feed your Dragonite a virtual berry or to touch it and make it interact with you. And it feels like it's right there in the world with you. And then I wanted to just mention one more term that you might have heard of, which is extended reality, or XR. And this is an umbrella term that holds both virtual reality and augmented reality, as well as any other experiences that are kind of in those gray areas. So next I thought I'd show you some examples of AR in action. So there are 3 defining characteristics of AR. And one of them is that it combines the real and the virtual. Now, a lot of augmented reality experiences started initially as ways of enhancing print media. So in the picture on the right, there's a picture of a book, and if you point your phone at it, you might be able to see an animation of that image that's in the book. There might be a sound associated with it. It would be a sense of kind of engaging with that book in the real world in a way that you couldn't with just plain print media. So it gives a sense that the book has kind of come to life. Another characteristic of AR is that it should happen seamlessly. So a lot of people have probably engaged with AR, maybe without even realizing it, through apps for shopping, like the one on the left, which shows how you might place a virtual version of a chair in your living room to decide if you like it before you commit to buying it. And so that seamless integration into the real world is really important. So you want to be able to make sure that that chair is the right size, that it's placed accurately, that you can mess with the angle, that it's sitting on the floor and not floating above that floor. And there are a lot of other app experiences that are similar to this. So you might have seen apps that allow you to try out eyeglass frames to see if you like them before you buy them. There are things like face filters, which make you look like a cat, things that allow you to change the color of your walls or the carpet on your floors, so that you can check those things out before you buy them. And as you can imagine, those experiences need to seem real in order for them to work. You're not going to buy a chair if you can't be reasonably confident that it looks like it's going to look when it's in your living room. And then the final characteristic of AR is that it should be interactive. So the middle picture here on the slide is from Pokemon Go, and this is one of the main game screens. So one of the premises of Pokemon Go was that it could be a game that would make you feel like Pokemon were in your world. So it was a fitness game, so you walk around your actual neighborhood, and the map on the screen would represent an actual map of that person's place where they were. And then the GPS in your phone keeps track of where you are, and it also keeps track of things like what's around you. So if you're near water Pokemon might appear. If it's raining or snowing, special Pokemon might appear. There are some Pokemon that only appear at night, for instance. And those things change. So as your weather changes, your experience in the game also changes. And then there are some other things too. So you can think about having to catch Pokemon using your screen, but also there are a lot of social experiences in the game. So there are some things you can't do in the game unless you team up with other people. And in order for that to work, those people have to be in the same physical location as you. They have to actually be in the same place as you. So it's a way of kind of gathering people together. And this was a game that wanted to get people walking, and it worked. So when I first started playing this game, I was in a small town in Illinois, and there was this park downtown that was basically deserted during the day. But when the game came out, suddenly there were people there all the time. There were people walking, just circling the park. It really changed the experience of our town. The other thing that happened was that people lost weight. I had friends that walked so much playing Pokemon Go that they lost 20 pounds, which is a really big thing for a game to be able to do. It encouraged us to visit places in the town we might not have visited otherwise, and it made me pay really close attention to things that I would normally pass without thinking about them. So I got to know a lot about the Lincoln statues in my town. I know about the Korean War Memorial, like all these things that I should have known about before but hadn't really paid attention to. And it was also a great way to get to know people in town that I wouldn't have interacted with otherwise. When you meet up with people in random places to catch Zapdos, you kind of start to get to know them, even though you may have nothing in common other than the game. And the thing that I thought was really interesting about this experience was that it started to encourage people to have conversations about how we interact with places and what does it mean as far as playing a game in a place, and how does that change between different people. So for instance, when the game first came out, there were a lot of conversations about like, should you be able to play Pokemon Go in a cemetery? And what does that mean for how we think about cemeteries and death and things like that? And then also more complicated discussions about things like gender and race and place and the things that structure and sort of influence those places. So I remember one conversation we had on a Facebook group that was meant for rating was a woman talking about how she liked to play at 3 o'clock in the morning and how a specific place in our downtown made her feel uncomfortable. And then another person who was a Black man talking about also having that experience for completely different reasons. And these discussions were really complex, and they were not just in the abstract, they were about very specific places in our town, and they were with strangers. So it was a really interesting social mechanism that encouraged us to have really deep conversations about place. So beyond Pokemon Go, I think this raises some useful questions for us as people who are interested in stories. What does it mean when a story blurs the boundaries between the fictional world and an actual place? How does it change our experience of story? And how does it change our experience of place? So up next, I wanted to show you an AR exhibit by the artist Heather Dunaway Smith. And this is a piece that she made for Earth Day that's meant to raise awareness of climate change and issues related to sustainability. So this is an AR experience that you can place anywhere. So you could put it in your living room, or you could put it in a forest like it is in the example. And as you're engaging with it, it starts off, as you saw, with water rising, and that's meant to be a little bit of a physical experience. It's meant to make people uncomfortable in the way that climate change should make people uncomfortable. And then there are these objects that you can click on, and as you click on them, there's a visual representation of how long it takes that particular object to decompose. And so if you can imagine accessing this in your house, you might look at those objects that are digitally created and also then look beyond them to the objects that are in your environment and think about your own personal role in these things and the ways that what we buy and consume can contribute to these issues. Another thing that's great about this kind of experience is it helps visualize something that can be hard to see. So a quote from Heather Dunaway Smith, she says, "One of the superpowers of mixed reality is its ability to help us wrap our heads around large numbers. One of my goals was to allow people, myself included, to really see the lifespan of ordinary products. We are surrounded by almost immortal objects." So as an artist, I'm really fascinated by the narrative experience of this media and the ways that it's so rooted in physical surroundings and personal experience. There are a lot of interesting elements, and I'm still kind of trying to wrap my head around them personally, and to just think about what it means to create a story like this and all of the different things you might do, not just in terms of narrative experience, but also in terms of social change. And so I thought I would just finish up my portion of the presentation by raising some questions that I think are useful to consider. So what happens when a narrative blurs the line between the real and the imagined? How does this change how we think of story, and how does it change how we think of ourselves and the places around us? How does this affect what we expect from our entertainment experiences? If this becomes an increasingly common narrative experience, which I think it will, what does this mean for us as writers and artists, and how do we need to think differently about how stories work? What does this mean for our capacity as storytellers? So what can we do in this media? Can this kind of art change the world? And how might it do that differently than is possible in other media? So I recommend Helen Papagiannis's book for anyone interested in further reading. It's called The Augmented Human. This is a really new technology, and so there's a lot of potential for fear and anxiety and worried thinking. And one thing I like about this book is that it's rooted in practicality and optimism, and in examples of AR experiences that already exist. So I just wanted to finish my segment by including a quote from this book. So Papagiannis writes, "It's my hope that these new technologies will be used in ways to support human interaction, connection, and communication, and even build empathy. And these are goals that a lot of us share as writers and artists in general. And I appreciate the way that Papagiannis approaches AR from this perspective of opportunity and potential. It's a new technology. There are a lot of unknowns. It's really difficult to predict what will happen. But in the end, it's really up to us as artists and educators and storytellers to use these technologies in ways that help us meet our own goals and to make us more aware and more connected to the places and people around us. And this isn't an impossible goal. This is within our grasp, and we should feel empowered and capable of doing that." So I'm going to hand things off now to my colleague, Chris Williams, who's going to talk about the Phoenix AR project that we've been working on. Thank you.
So Julia has discussed both the advent of AR and its contemporary expression in storytelling. Now, I'd like to focus on how we've gone about implementing some of those ideas into practice here at UWGB campus. Julie and I, along with our students and community members, have spent the last year thinking about a core question. How do we tell augmented reality stories on our campus? The result of those conversations is Phoenix AR. And I'll spend my time during this talk presenting the development process of this app, the type of stories the app values and features, and the possible pathways the app might explore in the future. So to begin with, what is Phoenix AR? Before we discuss the development of Phoenix AR, it's helpful to give an overview of the app itself. Phoenix AR is an app designed to tell stories, histories, and experiences of underrepresented communities here at UWGB, and in the Northeast Wisconsin area. It does so through augmented reality. Users will download the app for either Android or iOS devices, most likely a smartphone. It's location-based, which means that users need to go to a location, a designated place on campus in this case, to experience the app. These locations will be such things as the GBOS office or the Phoenix statue. This will trigger the AR experience through either scanning the physical object itself, such as a quilt in a First Nation Studies office, or a specific physical marker, often a placard or sign placed near the location itself. Those AR experiences that are triggered by the app will be as varied as locations chosen. And I'll describe a few as we discuss the app development process. So that's how the app itself functions. But that's just one part of the Phoenix AR app. The true meaning of it comes through the histories and experiences that it features, through the stories that it tells. So we come back to the kind of stories we want to tell through augmented reality. What does that look like? And why do you want to tell them through AR? Well, we tell stories centered on land and community. In AR storytelling and in our campus, the place, the location, becomes an important part of the story as the augmented experience itself. Indeed, it is integral to the experience, as users need to be physical location space for the experience to function at all. In this way, place and story are intimately, inextricably connected. For Phoenix AR, place means land. And since we're telling stories about this land, Julie and I decided the first stories that should be told through this app should be the stories of the original inhabitants of this land. To that end, we partnered with Dr. Lois Stevens in the First Nation Studies office here at UWGB to tell the stories of the First Nation peoples upon whose land our institution resides. Our initial work on Phoenix AR dovetailed with an initiative to explore further ways to feature the land acknowledgement on our campus. We started there, with an interest to offer ways to make the land acknowledgements more than something read at the start of a university function, but to make it intentional and interactive, a reminder that peoples whose histories and stories are tied to this land, and a celebration of the contemporary indigenous communities who call this area home. So this is one Phoenix AR site, the land acknowledgement plaque and the tribal seat plaque in the University Union on the GB campus. Scanning the land acknowledgement plaque with this app will reveal a top-down map illustrating the ancestral tribal lands of Wisconsin, and an audio recording of the land acknowledgement will be read. Scanning the seal plaque with the app will trigger each seal on the app there, and there's a few of them, rendered as a 3D object. Users can then press each seal, which will flip and reveal information about each tribe and links to their websites. The goal of both these experiences is to invite the user to consider that the stories of the First Nation communities are not just history, but part of an active and vibrant ongoing relationship to the land upon which we work and live. We also tell stories driven by students. When Julie and I were in the planning stages of Phoenix AR, there was a lot in the development process that was unclear. We knew two things, however, for certain. One, we were going to make something. And two, our students will be making that thing right along with us. We're a student-centered university here at UWGB, and Phoenix AR is reflective of that. Students were involved at each step in this process, from the initial brainstorming of potential sites to the app, to designing a user interface that is accessible and engaging, to collecting the stories, histories, and experiences that will be featured in the app. All of this driven by students. A clear example of this is the Phoenix statue site featured there on the slide. This was the second site that students determined needed to be included in the app, given its importance to our campus community. So at this site, users would scan a designated marker situated near the statue and be greeted with a 3D model of an anomaly village, similar to the one that existed at the land that the campus now occupies. Students, with guidance from First Nation Studies, were the ones to determine how and critically where this particular story should be told. We are also fortunate to partner with a development team that is as passionate about student and community engagement as we are. Foresight Studios, a Milwaukee-based XR studio, worked with students throughout the whole process, including on-campus visits in which students were able to experience firsthand the potentials of XR and AR storytelling. So featured here on the slide are examples from that visit. The top photo features a student in full VR regalia navigating a world built by Foresight Studios, as we talk about the stories that can be told through that virtual reality experience. The bottom photo features that same campus visit in which Foresight Studios is showing off some of the potentials in AR. On the TV screen there, it might be kind of hard to make out. You can see 3 different animals that are generated through scanning a marker on there. And students then discuss about what we could do with this technology to tell the stories that our community values. We tell stories that invite future possibilities. It is our hope that Phoenix AR builds upon the important work of land acknowledgement by providing both a space and a vehicle to tell the stories of this place, this land. But the goal of Phoenix AR is to tell the stories from the entirety of UWGB and its communities it calls home. We're a 4-campus institution with a 16-county footprint. There's a lot of stories in there. Stories from communities that need to be told. And Phoenix AR, with its focus on community engagement and the importance of place, could be the way to tell those stories. But UWGB is more than just its campuses. Each campus is an active part of their respective communities, and those communities contain more stories and histories of experiences of underrepresented populations. We hope to engage with both local organizations and community organizations to discover both the stories they want to tell and the way to tell those stories through AR. And lastly, and important to me, we haven't exhausted the potentials and possibilities for Phoenix AR. As Julie pointed out, there is a lot to explore here. It's exciting, it can be overwhelming, but there's all kinds of places we can go. And our students are active participants in that exploration, alongside the professionals we partner with. Here's a small example. I taught a class last semester designed to provide space for students to work on this app development. At the end of the class, a student approached me and said, "Every day, I left class saying, I didn't know I could do that." That there refers to what we worked on that day, whether it be brainstorming an AR app itself, thinking about user interface that's engaging and accessible and important, or just being part of a team that's working on something new, something uncharted, something that we're discovering how to build together. And then they said, "But I did. I did do that." I carry that with me, and that's part of the project of Phoenix AR, to discover what we didn't know we could do, and through doing so, discover new ways to tell stories that foster empathy and connection, that intertwine history and contemporary experiences, that ask us to think critically about the intersection of place and of story. Thanks for listening.
Thanks, Chris. Really appreciate it. Thanks for coming to hang out with me. Yeah, and so normally I just get right into questions, but this listening to I had seen the slide presentation, but I hadn't heard the presentation. And so, Julie, when you were talking about, so I did, for all the viewers out there, I did the homework. I read this last night. And you described how it could generate sort of fear. And I think that thinking about this topic was the first time that I felt I was being close to being left behind in some ways, and reading this book. And so I'm looking forward to sort of just like getting my feet under me a little bit. And so I guess an opening question for me is, in the past, I tend to sort of smash all these terms together, VR, AR, but you've clearly made a choice for augmented reality over virtual reality. Can both of you talk a little bit about like why that choice? Like why does augmented reality draw you more?
Sure. So I think for me, I'm really interested in both of these forms, and I think they are very different. So in virtual reality, you're in a totally different world, right? I mean, it could look like the real world, or maybe it's a recording of the real world or something like that. But it basically is about being in a place that's set off from the physical world. Mm-hmm. And there's some really great things about that and some really cool things that you can do with that. But I think the thing that most interests me about augmented reality is the way that the experiences with Pokemon Go and some of the other installations, that it encouraged me to think differently about actual places, right? It's like taking you through the physical world and making you look at it differently. And it's really hard, I think, once you've been through that experience to go back to the way it was before. So I remember when I first started playing Pokemon Go, there were these gyms, and teams would take the gyms and they'd become different colors based on which team had them. And so the only way you can tell which team has a gym is by looking on your phone. But sometimes I would leave my house and I'd walk and I'd look at the place in the world where the gym was supposed to be, and I'd get really grumpy because I couldn't tell which team had the gym because I wasn't looking through my phone. And I remember, and it was just a way of thinking about the world that I couldn't quite go back from, right? I feel like once it made me see the world in that way, it was hard to see it differently. And so I think there's some really cool things that you can do with AR that shape not just the narrative or not just the virtual elements, but also your actual world. Mm-hmm. And that seems really cool and something that I don't think other media can do.
Yeah. So I think for us, the reason we're working on this app in AR is it comes down to the nature of the stories we want to tell. But we started that. Like, we knew about a year ago that we wanted to work with some sort of XR technology. And we knew we wanted to tell stories from underrepresented communities. That was the few things we wanted to do there. So we thought particularly, like, well, these communities have been in this place, Northeast Wisconsin, for, a long, long time. All kinds of communities with that. So it becomes important to acknowledge, like, the brand is that. And what is VR, which is a great form for telling stories that exist in, like, a different world we create. AR is about our world. It's about transforming the places that we might take for granted as we walk by, whether it be, the Korean War Memorial, as you say before, or, for example, I did my PhD in Milwaukee. And when Pokemon Go came out, I made this very clearly, there's a nice park up there called Lake Park. And for a lot of residents in Milwaukee, it was the first time ever going to that place. It created tensions within the communities there, but it was the first time they actually explored that. So it becomes a way to transform a place, to have a new experience at a place. And that's particularly what we're hoping to do here, I think, with the AR versus VR choice.
This book is only 130 pages, but it actually takes a while to go through if you start going to all of the sample AR exhibits. I don't know if exhibits is even the right word. Some of which you have to access in different places now. Like, I was sort of struck by reading about AR through the medium that I love the most, which is the book. And of course, some of the websites are outdated and you have to find them. But before we get back to your project itself, I want to ask about Pokemon Go, because I feel like for some, this was the first introduction to this kind of technology and experience. And I'm trying to think of a historical comparison. So, I was driving around Green Bay, and if I'm seeing this in Green Bay, I'm trying to imagine what this would have looked like in other cities, or even Milwaukee for that matter. And you're seeing all these people walking around, looking at stuff, but you don't know what they're looking at. And as an observer, it seems weird. And I found like it was kind of divisive too, like in terms of response, in a way that you wouldn't respond if you saw people like playing badminton or something in a park, that the response was different. But when you think about Pokemon Go and that whole experience, is that going to be an important historical event? Like, I was trying to compare it to like the Armory show in Chicago, where Cubism was first introduced and people rioted and were upset about this. But are people underestimating the importance of this thing? Or is it just normal to you? Like, it's not important.
No, I mean, I think it is important. And I think when you talk to people that played Pokemon Go, I think by and large, whenever I bring up the subject with people that played it the summer it came out, people are just, you should experiment by asking people, but people are so excited to talk about the magic that it was, because it transformed places, it really changed behaviors, and it was really interesting and kind of magical. I think in our society, we tend to have attitudes toward games in particular that are a little bit dismissive and a little bit reluctant to acknowledge anything good happening in them. And so I feel like that just kind of happens in general, regardless of the game. And so I think partly, people maybe have been reluctant to look at Pokemon Go as anything special because it's, a Pokemon game like all the other Pokemon games. And don't we want our kids to play badminton and do something else? But yeah, I feel like increasingly people are starting to recognize that these experiences you can't lump them all together, and you can't also dismiss them as being escapist or reductive or bad, that there's actually really interesting things happening. And so I don't know if it will be as transformative as the show in Chicago, but hopefully people will use it as a touch point.
And you mentioned like that, people's attitude toward games, which I find interesting. And I was having trouble like separating, was it their attitude toward games or their attitude toward phones? Because I saw people walking around looking at their phones, and I wouldn't normally associate that with games. And I think about the anxiety built up around devices and young people on devices and people staring at their phones constantly. And so I watched the trailer, so the fact that this had a trailer to me is an interesting thing. So it's like a movie. So I watched this trailer for Pokemon Go, and anybody watching, I encourage you to just Google it and watch it. And I could see it having a really varied response, in that if you were into it and you could see it, you'd be really excited about it. But then you could be another person who just saw a lot of people standing around looking at their phones, right? And to me, that felt like, I want to say I'm overstating this, but I don't think I am, it felt like a radical kind of manifesto that you can experience joy and pleasure through this particular device. And I mean, is it a radical sort of statement on storytelling and entertainment?
I think, it's funny you bring this up, because as you're speaking about all this, your device, if you can imagine this, it seems like we're relitigating an argument that Joel and I have faced probably entirely our career: are video games art? But you mentioned that you brought up the Cubism show, is Pokemon Go the next sixth gallery you're reading, and that's something I think we both have had to encounter, and I don't know, we actually haven't talked about how you feel about this, but make the case that video games can be transformative experiences. So, when you say radical manifesto, I'm thinking about what you might mean by that is that proposes an intervention in how we live our lives. That's what a manifesto is. This is how you should be doing things. Mm-hmm. We're doing things wrong, we need to do this, right? So I don't know in that sense if it's saying we're doing things wrong, I guess, but I think it is saying this is what we can do, right? To your point, is this the first time that AR existed? No, but where I saw a bunch of people who were aware of AR for the first time, certainly. And what that's going to do is invite more people thinking about, what can I do with this? Right?
To me, it's interesting that you mentioned games, because I found myself wavering between AR and games, but not as synonymous terms. And so, you would say, well, are games art? And I would say, well, absolutely, they are. And we could go on for a long time about that. But not all AR is games or even storytelling. Right. For that matter. And I felt like there's AR and technology writ large in some ways. And is there, I guess for the both of you, is storytelling the thing that bridges the sort of the terrain where games exist and then things that wouldn't necessarily be a game? My favorite exhibit from this book was the first one, and sorry to people, you can't see this, but they would stand in front of a triptych of screens and flap their arms, and then the arms turned into wings, and then the people dissolved into birds. And it wasn't a game, but it was definitely a story. Was that a question? Did that sort of make sense?
I think what you're highlighting is the notion of interactivity, right? I think that's something that connects all these things. I guess I find myself to your point, what would make a Phoenix AR is not a game. Right? But it has interactive elements to that. So yeah, I think when you think about there's a delineation between what draws us to this project, I guess, or maybe what makes AR work for me is the element of storytelling. Mm-hmm. As I know this is something that's close to Julie's heart too, but the idea of building empathy through storytelling. AR becomes a great vehicle to do that, especially we can say like for the Menominee Village. These people lived here, right? This is on the ground that is, has been occupied for a long, long time before you were here. This is what that looked like. Like, it's hard to say that you can't, there's ways to bridge connection through superimposing, AR experiences onto where you currently are.
And it's a lot different to be able to actually see the village and hear it and learn about it that way than to just have someone tell you or to read about it in a book. I feel like having that so connected to place and to have the physical experience of that is probably more something that stays with you, I feel like. And it might partially be just because the technology is new and we haven't quite been desensitized to it yet, but it feels like it does stick with you in a way. And so I do think for me, you asked about games and storytelling, and I think for me a lot of my love of games came through stories, as a kid being like, this is a really cool way to tell stories and to participate in stories, and how can I do this as a writer, and how can I do this as a person that likes working with technology. Yeah. And it just feels like there's a lot of really cool potential, and I think a lot of the sort of options and the things that are possible haven't really been developed yet. And so that's what I think is also really cool, is we get to be part of that. Like, we get to decide and we get to start thinking about how do you make an experience in AR, and what does that mean, and how does that work, and what are the limits of this form?
This feels really early stage, and I forget the phrase in the book, like, is just sort of like the wet clay part of things, and that people don't really know what to do yet. And so as I was reading this, I downloaded an AR app and started placing little dinosaurs on my bookcases and stuff, and it's like, okay, that's really cool, but what now? And it felt, just hearing you talk makes me think of, say, when photographs first were a thing, like what that meant for painting, like what does AR mean for novels or movies, kind of thing. But to your project, and one of the questions that came in was, is Phoenix AR something that can be expanded to other places and universities? And I wanted to pair that with a question of, just been thinking a lot about medium, and so this is a very tech-heavy medium, and in reading this book, a lot of references, you can't get around it, to companies, the people who make software, who do programming. And I wonder, so if we're doing a First Nations or exhibit, who's the audience for that? Like, is this a medium that, say, First Nations communities would connect to easily, or they connect to it just as easily as anybody else would, because nobody's really on the leading edge? But does that make sense?
Yeah, I feel like for me it's the latter. I think a lot of people are looking at AR and they're just kind of like, I don't really know what we do with this. So I think that's one of the things that Chris and I really prioritized in this, is it wasn't just about how to make an AR project on campus to tell underrepresented stories, but also educating people about what AR even is and how it works and what you can do with it. And that's something that we've tried to really prioritize. And I think to your point about AR being tech heavy and being sort of the purview of corporations, the sort of downside of that is that if people are reticent to engage with it, if they feel like, oh, this is new and this is weird and I don't know if I like it yet, then what that means is that the companies get to be the ones that do it first. And companies have sort of, especially tech companies, have traditionally been sort of, a certain demographic. And what that means is that then those are the predominant voices in that technology, and that leaves behind a lot of other voices. And so, yeah, I don't know that anyone is like, AR really speaks to me as the form of the future, but if it's not speaking to any of us, and if it's something that's really cool that we can use, like, we might as well put it in the hands of people that can take charge of it and maybe be a leading force in making those exhibits and things like that.
I just think it's a natural sort of, like a knee-jerk reaction I have to, like, reading about the future of education and all of these startups and Silicon Valley, and this will do this for you. And this book was reading a little bit like that, after a while. But I don't think that's a fault of the book at all. And another question came in, and in the many conversations I've had with the both of you, I can just name a game, and then you both know it. And so what do you think of the AR game Pokemon Smile? Is that something that you know? Is this the first time that you're stumped?
I haven't played that one. but I would love to hear more about it, and I will check it out. Do you know that one?
Unfamiliar.
This is a historic first. This is a historic first. Chris, I want to come back to something that you had said about the project and during the presentation. So how do you both involve students in what you're doing, and like why is it important for them to be involved in that process, in this thing? Like, if to me it feels different than Chris, you and I both teach poetry, right? Like an American poetry class, in a survey, like this feels so wide open. So what are you seeing, the both of you, in the students, and what are they getting out of it?
Yeah, so, when I first, I speak directly to the AR app class. I talk about, we're just going to make AR stuff. Don't know what that's going to be yet. And when I first started teaching it, I was oh, wait, I cannot teach just like I taught poetry. I can't teach that mindset. I would say, we're going to be poets and make poems. So what ended up happening is I was encouraging students to think like a designer. You might design poems, and one way to say that, but we design an app, you're doing a completely different environment. And so I've had other students in my classes now, who are in that class, start thinking about their own creative works in a different way. So it becomes a way for them to reimagine what they could do outside of AR by working through AR, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. To another point, part of the reason that I think it's so important to include students in this process, regardless of our mission here at UWGB, is that, I mentioned before, I was in college, and obviously when Pokemon Go came out. My experience with Pokemon Go is vastly different than some of these students, right, who are maybe part of a different friend group, all of this. So in many respects, they've kind of developed along with that. They come to AR with the same preconceived notions that you or I might jug, right? What this can do, what is this different from a novel? And it's proved out in a lot of the classes sessions we had where they discussed possibilities. And one of my favorite things that happened, particularly when Foresight visited, they would ask questions like, is this possible? They weren't thinking about this is not possible. They were thinking about, okay, can we do this? And Foresight was kind of taken aback sometimes, yeah, what would that look like? So it became much more of a collaboration between people who has ideas that weren't precluded by this is what this technology can do.
Mm-hmm. I think about it. So the three of us have at different times taught creative writing courses of some kind. And, it's not really until recently in my career that world building became an established term. Maybe if you were teaching genre fiction or something, right? But it just, what you just said, actually what you both have been saying, makes me think about world building and storytelling. Are those things synonymous, or is there an evolution here where we're moving away from a different kind of, certain a plot arc, and to something else that is more world building than a Newtonian world of cause and effects and that kind of stuff? You don't get to look at each other in silence.
I'm deferring to Julie here as more the world-building expert.
Well, yeah, I think there are two questions, right? And I feel like you have some interesting things to say about world building.
I tend to 5 at the same time, so.
But then you also mentioned, I think so yes, I feel like world building is increasingly important in contemporary storytelling because we have a lot of stories that go beyond the bounds of one movie or one book, right? There are stories that have huge canons, and part of that is about creating a world and a timeline and a history and being able to create lots of different stories within that world and lots of different perspectives. I feel like that's really, really important to contemporary approaches to storytelling. But then I think the other thing that made me think of the stuff that you do is the idea of, you put people into a world and maybe there's a story associated with that world. But then I think also increasingly in games, there's a sense that you can go into a game and you can follow the quests and, the main storyline and stuff, but you can also, choose to do something totally different, and you can create your own story within that world. Mm-hmm. And there's something I think really cool that's happening in that way. I feel like people are empowered and kind of excited about that. I feel like you have more to say about this.
No, I think if the question is world building and storytelling synonymous, I don't think they are. Right? To my mind, world building is more creating the spaces in which stories happen. And that's what I'm drawn to it about. You create, it's, this comes back to my central practice as a creative person. I like to create circumstances in where weird stuff happens. And the weird stuff happening, that's the story, right? So that's why I try to inculcate in my students. So, that's, I think, part of, I guess, the lineage of people. Like, well, part of my hobby horse recently is to say, the stories we tell through gaming, particularly like tabletop games, are valid and important. Right? Equally valid as like writing a fiction story.
Well,
right?
I'm just going to say, obviously. Okay, yeah.
Right. But
Everybody knows that. No, I'm just kidding.
No, but there's not a bunch of classes actually doing that.
Yeah.
So this is probably, I think, the AI thing, the stories we're telling through AR, is equally important as, a short story.
Yeah, I guess I used, there were times when I would teach certain writers, like nature writers in particular, somebody like Rick Bass, if that rings a bell. And to me, the setting, place were the characters. The main character was place. And in hearing you talk that in world building, you're talking so much about place, that this thing was here, that the story is the place a lot of times at least in some of the exhibits that you're describing or what your project is, that the story is the place, right? And so world building would be the medium for that, or a strategy. I don't even know if medium's the right word.
Yeah, I think world building to me always implies this fictional thing you're building. And not necessarily, but even the Marvel Cinematic Universe, right? Even when they're building the version in New York, aliens exist. We can argue about what that's true or not, but in that world that happens. So they're imposing a fictional part on a real world, right? At the very minimum of that. Whereas what we're trying to do with AR, I think, is not necessarily world building, but acknowledging that, drawing attention to things that have always been here, right? So to your point, a place is the story because it doesn't function without it. You have to be in that physical location to trigger it. So choosing which location you want to do this at is very important. Like we talked about, the touchstones we're going to choose for this app. One of which is the Phoenix statue because it's centrally located. It feels like it's a sort of embodiment of what we're doing here. And what story, with the story you have to tell that should be it should be a fundamental, important experience.
And that's a relatively new addition to campus too. Yeah, and so there are so many places that I want to take this next. So if you think about talking about storytelling and world building, I'm thinking about people who would come to an AR experience for the first time, and the storytelling that they're used to is, especially coming through COVID, is streaming, a show on Netflix and binging shows. There's more content in that way now than ever, or comics or graphic novels or reading novels. Is there a possibility, is there a familiarity of enough that if you step from one of those genres into an AR experience, that storytelling will make sense to you, that you would interpret it as storytelling?
I think we're still getting to that point, and I think you're right. I don't know that AR experiences are inherently storytelling experiences necessarily, they don't have to be that. But I think we're very consciously trying to create an experience that works from one setting or one location to the next. But there are a lot of questions you have to consider, right? Because, if there are 6 locations on our campus, you can't predict where a person's going to enter the stream, or where they're going to leave, or if they're going to go to all 6, or they're just going to visit one. And so there's a lot of thinking that you have to do as far as how do people move through places, how are they going to engage with places, and that kind of thing. I think, too, to your point about streaming, I feel like one thing that's really important to think about is that these experiences are experiences that happen through your phone, right? So you mentioned earlier about seeing people on their phones in a park and being grumpy about that. Would that have been...
That's just the literal old man in me.
Okay. Would that have been different if you'd seen 100 people reading a book in a park? Probably not. What about if they were reading a book on their phone, right?
Yeah.
But I think we all have these really, all don't, but I think a lot of people have really close relationships with their technology. It is a part of you. It feels weird if you leave it. And so there is something comforting about that too, in a way.
To me, it feels like a massive cultural misunderstanding in a way. If I saw a bunch of people sitting in a park reading a book, I don't think they're talking to their friends who aren't there. I see the book and I recognize the book and I know they're reading a book, regardless of what the content is. But this phone is everything. So I could be staring at my phone, I could be watching a show, I could be reading a book, I could be chatting with someone. And so maybe the default is you see everybody on their phones staring at them and well, of course, they're playing Candy Crush. and that's obviously useless.
Or reading a novel, or doing important work. I think it's funny that we say, like, somebody looking at a phone or a piece of technology, we automatically go like they're wasting time, right? Unless we can see this in like a very much a work setting, as in like you're engaging in the means of commerce with this technology. Good for you. But yet, if we're doing something for recreation or to explore connection to each other or whatever it is like that, we also get kind of salty about it. I think it says more about us than it does about the people actually using the device.
Yeah.
Well, isn't it true that it was better to hold up lighters at concerts than it was phones? I mean, isn't that an objective
Oh,
fact?
I can see that one point, perhaps.
I don't know, till you like burn people's
Yeah,
hair and
right.
stuff.
It's so much less of a fire hazard than it used to be.
But also, I think part of the reason that Julie and I are engaged in this AR thing from the jump here is we want to make sure that we get our hands on this ball before these giant corporations do what they want with it.
Yeah, I
The
think
people
you're.
pushing like this forward and making interesting stuff, for the most part, are always artists. Right? Even people who make tech apps, they have a bit of an artist streak in them. People want to create something to push boundaries and see what it does, not necessarily to turn a profit out of it all the time.
I guess the reason, and to be clear, like the reason I'm sort of harping on the phone element is, to me, it feels like it's creating a divide in accessing an art form or bringing respectability to it in a way that other mediums are not inhibited by in some way.
Yeah, and I wonder to what extent that's just us with our ideas, right? Like if we had grown up with phones, maybe we wouldn't feel that
And
way.
by us, you really mean?
No.
I'm just
I
kidding.
mean, I feel like, and I think too, it's we're human, and so things that are new are scary, and that's good, right? Like if there's something scary and it's going to eat us, we don't want to go up to it and be like, oh, that's weird.
This is true.
And so I think technology, it's changing so much, and it's so unpredictable that it is still scary, and it's hard for
Yeah.
it to ever get past that because we can't get used to it. It just keeps developing.
I mean, the novel is relatively recent, right? All these things we have lately, it was a relatively recent development. We're not reading this in cuneiform anymore. At least, I know I'm not.
Yeah.
So maybe it's just a measure of like time.
But novels are still, to your point, novels are still scary to people. I mean, there was just an article in one of the local papers the other day about books they're pulling off shelves in local schools, right? And why is that? Because there is a certain fear attached to what would be received from that experience. So I want to go back to something about Pokemon Go again. So I think of that as a group experience, right? Even though you could see people walking around by themselves and doing this, and I do feel like there were news stories that sensationalized bad things that happened because of this. And but in reading Augmented Human, like I think repeatedly, one of the things that's offered as a benefit is sort of this radical personalization, that you, using AR, can completely personalize your world in a way that everything is about you and what you want, and that is a good thing. But I hear you talking about the more group experiences, and it didn't seem that you had complete control over those, that there was a community element to them. So do you have feelings about sort of this radical personalization? That one of the examples in the book was, and I actually kind of love this, was somebody who came up with an app that if you had, I guess you have to have glasses for this to work, certain like Google glasses, whatever, that would automatically turn billboards and advertisements into paintings and works of art. And that's freaking brilliant. But then it talked more about erasure, like that you could essentially, a lot of references to TV in here, Black Mirror especially, but that you could block people that you didn't like from your view. You could just erase them from your vision. And I don't know, so how do you feel about that? How do you feel about erasing people from your lives? Or just like sort of the promise that really what the benefit here is to tailor everything about the world to you and your tastes?
I mean, I feel like in that particular example, that one really stood out to me too, and I love that idea because it is like, I feel like Chris and I talk a lot about how to take back some agency from corporations that seem to have so much power over technology. And I love that you could have like an ad blocker in your life. Like you could just cut off all the ads and turn them into paintings. That's awesome. I think that's great. But you're right. I feel like there are things to think about as far as blocking people. But I also feel like what's more likely to happen? Is it more likely that people are going to want to get rid of ads, or is it more likely that people are going to want to get rid of their annoying neighbor? And what's going to be easier? And probably the ads are going to be easier. And so I feel like until we get to the point where we're actively like not seeing people, maybe we worry about that then, and maybe we think more about like, what are the cool things that you can do with personalization? So one of the things she talks about is that these AR experiences don't have to be social, they can just be personal. So for instance, you could create an augmented exhibit in your child's bedroom of photos of your child through the years, and that would be something you experienced as a family, and that would only have meaning for your family, but would be really cool, right? Something that you can make and that you have control over and that means something to you.
Yeah.
I think that there's something to be said about those AR experiences too.
And we get to shape those. I think that's the other way that we're missing out on this too. Like it's fun to kind of engage in the Black Mirror technophobia. Like what can go with this technology when the singularity happens or whatever, right? We enjoy those things, like thinking about those causal scenarios, which haven't happened yet. And I think, something you said, Julie, in your talk here is that we can control what's going to happen with this, particularly if we have engaged in a radical manifesto in which we, seize the means of AR production, away from these people that might do things like that, right? We get to shape what this might happen next.
So if I could invent a word, right, even though you already said somebody has it, but like technesia, that I'm learning a lot from this, and that I feel like I could make the same arguments now that I could about the internet and what the promise of the internet was and what it's become in a lot of ways. Like the promise of this radical democracy, that everybody would have access and power. And really what we've ended up with is intense centralization, that this would result in wealth redistribution, but we've had concentration instead. And I mean, there's a cynical part of me that looks at this and says, I could just make the same arguments that, okay, we can say we're going to do all these great things, but of course the pornographic industry is going to run wild in this, or people are going to, when we're talking about erasure, that you could have a pair of Google glasses and erase people of an ethnicity so you would never see them. But that seems that would happen without it anyway. Like those feelings would still be there, I guess. And so I think the challenge that you keep bringing up is like, what do you do when you want to tell stories and use this medium that is much more dependent on corporate production than some other mediums?
I think the thing that's important to remember is that whatever terrible or awful scenarios we imagine are not inherent in the technology. It's not like you invent AR and you let people use it and suddenly bad things happen. It's right. It's like, here we have this technology and it is literally open to whatever we want it to be. And so, it could become a terrible dystopia where there's lots of porn and people are erasing people of other ethnicities. Maybe. But I mean, we've gone through a lot of other technologies and we haven't arrived at that dystopia. So why is this the thing that's going to get us there?
And I was at a talk that I think that both of you and Brian Carr gave about like much more, maybe a micro version of this about Gamergate. And what I hear you saying sort of replicates that, and that there are these really awful things that exist in the culture of gaming, but we have to work to change those. And that you're actually seeing progress, if I remember that talk right. Both of you were seeing progress.
Tenuous progress, but yeah.
I mean, the thing is, if you are afraid or if you are anxious and you just push it away, then you're essentially abdicating responsibility. You're saying, like, this is bad, I don't want to mess with it. And then that lets the people that don't feel that way do whatever they want. And then it, I feel like, I don't feel like that's a choice I personally want to make.
Yeah. No, thanks for saying that.
There's a choice here too, I think. Do you choose not to be binary about it, like the light or the dark? Do you want to make something and try to change conversations, or do you just like, well, there's something that can be done, so that's it? Yeah. And I think with AR, particularly with the rise of anything new technology, it's really important from the start to have these critical conversations about what can happen here. Because I think nobody consulted me on the rise of the internet, right? But
they didn't.
Strangely, there was an important voice there.
You didn't have a conversation with Aldo.
But I wonder how many of these conversations actually happened around it, right? Yeah. And how much it wasn't just like fear mongering, but how the people trying to do productive things to say, let's shape this.
Yeah. And I think I'm sort of playing the role of fearmonger here, and what I'm really trying to say and what I'm experiencing is that in reading this is that I feel like that there is a trite, well-told, like sort of well-traveled path or trope of arguments about this. If it's not this, it's television. If it's not that, if it's not television, it's movies. We need rating systems. That's going to fix it all. And now that we have NC-17, like there are no problems with movies anymore. And I'm trying to like recognize what are the real arguments that we should be having that don't feel like all the ones that I've pretty much wasted most of the time of this talk bringing up. Like, what should we really be talking about? And I kind of hear that and actually I know what they are because they're coming in here. And so just let me get you back to your project here. This one is much more of a local question, which I love. Are there plans, or would you consider, I know the answer to this, integrating the Phoenix AR program with campus tours?
I mean, pretty much the answer, would you consider doing Phoenix AR is probably yes, right? The part of the reason I think we're both excited by this is that it doesn't just have to be storytelling. Although that's what Genesis is. It doesn't have to stop there. Right? There's all kinds of places that people can see how to use this thing and what things they might be productive and useful. So really all we're doing is creating like a framework that other folks can kind of do what they want with, right? Yeah, so I mean, we talked about the way we might want to do campus tours, particularly with like UAGB, like recruitment and retention, all of these things I think we see possibilities for.
When we initially came up with this idea, we had hoped that there would be sites on all 4 campuses and that there'd also be sites in the community, and that was much, much bigger than we were capable of doing in the time that we had. But yeah, I feel like initially we thought it would be great to have an AR network across Northeast Wisconsin.
And I think there'd be a real interest in that, I mean, the one thing that I'm sure this is common to all regions, but there really is a lot of change that is happening where we are, and people are interested in telling the stories of this region, especially as new people and populations move into it, like in a really positive way. Here's another one, and it starts with not a question, but I'll let you try to pull a response out of this anyway. Not a question. But someone said, wait until AR is delivered through wearable eyeglasses. You will simply not know what realities individuals are experiencing, neither good nor bad, but a cultural shift. And I guess even if you didn't have the glasses on, I wouldn't know what you were thinking, I guess, but.
It's true.
I mean, people try Google Glass, didn't really work out just yet, right? I think so, I mean, that's a good point, but I think we're kind of far away from that point yet. Perhaps I'm naive, but it feels like we're just now figuring that out, much less thinking about completely shifting people's reality through glasses.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like a lot of people have predicted that will happen, and that will be interesting to see. And I guess, yeah, we can be afraid now about what that will be, or we can just be like, wow, that'll be really interesting to see what that's like, and what can we do with that, and maybe that's really cool. I guess to go back to something you said earlier, it's like, how do we get away from fear-mongering, and what's the alternative? And I think, as 3 of us sitting up here, we're all writers and artists and storytellers, and so, like, the question that I have maybe for you and for you again is like, what would you make if you could? Like, if you could make an AR thing, or if you could turn a poem into an AR experience, what does that look like? Like, what can you make with this technology?
That was my question. I was gonna. So I was imagining, just thinking of a local space, and I was thinking of the Lawton Gallery and what it would mean to go into a space like that with just frames on the wall. And then to fill those with text, poems, visual poems, and they wouldn't need to be entirely contained to the frames, but I was trying to imagine something that was public, but also really personal, that you would walk into an empty room, because normally when you see an empty room, you have no expectations, you see nothing, but then to go into it and experience something from nothingness is something that this technology might allow me to do. That's just off the top of my head, so I apologize if that's...
No, that sounds so cool. I want you to make that.
That's really important. So that was actually going to be my question to the both of you was like, you're doing really interesting and exciting things. And one of the signal for me for an exciting thing is when people have a hard time talking about it, like I am right now. And, reading this book and thinking of the technology, I Googled a bunch of the technology, like you can use this or this camera or this. To your point about Google Glasses, like 2 or 3 of the things already mentioned in here are discontinued, and they have new names now. And so it seems we're in a period of a lot of fits and starts. And to me, that's just newness. That's like being an infant, in some ways. But if you could, can I ask you the same question? Like, what would you like to do? What would you like to try that would just be amazing?
So I've thought a lot about this. I have a lot of examples,
Okay.
but I'm just going to pick one. So I was thinking about one of the things that I love most about augmented reality is the way that you can encourage people to see wonder in a place that they might not see otherwise. So one of the places I really love on our campus is the Arboretum. I spend a lot of time running there. I love it. And the thing I like most about it is that you never really quite know what you're going to encounter. So sometimes there's deer, sometimes there's turtles or turkeys, or sometimes there's nothing. I've gotten hailed on, like you just never really know what's going to happen. And so I was trying to think about what would be an experience that would bring people to the Arboretum and would kind of encourage them to see the Arboretum in the way that I do. And so I thought it would be really cool to have like a cryptid that lives in our Arboretum and that you can only see through augmented reality. So I told some students about this, and I was initially thinking of a dragon because I love dragons, and they were like, no, it needs to be a phoenix. I was like, okay. But so like if you could go to, say, where the Arboretum Trail passes Lambeau Cottage on the bay, and sometimes you would point your phone at the bay and you'd see the phoenix like swooping and eating fish or something, but sometimes you'd go there and the phoenix wouldn't be there, and so you would never know when you got there whether it would be there or not. And sometimes you would be in the field and it would be like nesting there, or maybe something would be on fire because it accidentally set something on fire. But I like the idea of bringing people to a place, having them look for something, and then maybe the thing isn't there, but instead they notice like geese, or they notice ice, or they notice something cool. And so it's a way of kind of like bringing wonder to a place and helping people see it. And that to me is something that I think this technology can do that's really hard to do in other media.
Yeah, I mean, because I guess that hadn't really occurred to me in thinking of the examples that there is, and that's a term that is defined in here as presence, and that if you're going to create something, it's always present, but you're thinking of it almost random in a way that life would be, because that would be reality, right?
Yeah, and that's not a thing. I'm not sure if you could do that technically, but it's kind of speaking to
Well,
what you said earlier.
I mean, I would bike out by where I live to go. Sandhill cranes are my favorite. So I need to go see them and listen to them because their calls sound like doors that are stuck when you pull them and they shake, and they're sort of, but sometimes they're not there, and so that's what I hear you saying.
I think the thing that draws me to augmented reality experiences is the same thing that draws me in any art, whether it be poetry or games or whatever, and that's strangeness, defamiliarizing a place, kind of similar to what you're saying, the sense of wonder. I'm paraphrasing Francis Bacon here, I think, who says, hath not a thing of beauty a certain strangeness? And I love that phrase, a certain strangeness, a peculiarity to it. So an area experience for me would be taking a space you maybe intimately and adding something to it that seems transformative, right? Whether it be a dragon in an arboretum, which I think is a dangerous choice, right? Or a phoenix choice, right? Or a cryptid, a Bigfoot walking around in there or something, right? Or something even like in your own home, something that causes you to experience the place in a new light. Because I think that's really the potential of augmented reality, as opposed to virtual reality, is it lets you reframe something you may be taking for granted or didn't fully realize. So for me, like a true augmented reality experience would kind of do that. Same way I kind of like why I'm drawn to poetry. I'm drawn to poems that, take the top of my head off, to quote Emily Dickinson, that somehow make me think about something in a new way. I mean, I think that's probably true of most art that we appreciate, right?
I mean, hearing you say that, I feel like there's potential with, connection to the environment. And there were a lot of examples in here about using this for sort of for eco stories that maybe one of the reasons we're slow to react to climate change is the familiarity of the environment, that we need to defamiliarize it in a more radical and faster way ahead of the schedule in which it was being defamiliarized. So I appreciate that too. Any final words? If here's like for anybody who's watching, like if there's something they could go look at right now that is just an easily digestible example of what we're talking about, that they could just look, what would it, do you have a recommendation?
So I really love the work that Heather Dunaway Smith does, the example that I had in my presentation. One thing that's great about her work
That's
is that...
the head in the forest. Yep.
Yeah. So she was a, what do you call it, artist in residence for Adobe Aero, which is a free software program you can download. So it's, I think right now it's only available for Apple products, but there is a beta version that's for PC. And so you can look at her work and see how she used that program to create experiences. And Chris and I were lucky enough to be able to talk to her when we were putting together a Phoenix AR project. And it was really interesting to hear her talk about all of the things that I think we associate with storytelling, like thinking about beginnings and middles and endings and interactivity. And so her stuff is really well designed, and I think a great starting point, especially because on her website there are some places where she describes what she's doing and why.
I mean, when you talk to someone like that, do you feel like you're talking to an artist in the familiar way of talking with an artist, but also not?
What?
Because if I were to talk to a painter, like I would know.
Oh, you're saying if a poet talking to a poet, painting like the Frank O'Hara thing, why I'm not a painter, right?
Is there sort of a defamiliarization there that you're talking to this person and it's familiar, but it's also
we
not?
had this discussion. We were talking about elements of story here. Like she's thinking about the things I think about somewhat in poems, like what's the tone of this? So as much as like the medium is different, like the conversations we have about what this thing is doing are very similar. Yeah, and to build up what you said about how you've done with Smith's work, you mentioned Adobe Aero. Like the thing I would say to do is actually go out there and see what's out there, but also make something. The best way to, we're makers at heart here. The way we learn about something is by making something, and maybe it doesn't work, maybe it's a failure. But you understand how these parts function. And Adobe Aero, I think, is kind of user-friendly. There's a bunch of tutorials how to do this thing. And so the best way to think about the potentials of AR is actually make something AR.
So what's your recommendation?
What?
To go see something, like...
Oh, make something instead.
Oh, make something instead.
Yeah.
So do what I did, like point your phone at your bookshelves and
great example. So that lets you think about, because this also helps you reduce the idea of like what's still out there, what's still extant. But making something would help, when students, when we started doing that in my class, the AR class, we hadn't done that before we talked about the app itself. And that helped them understand, like, what can I do with this? And then we think about what this thing actually is. So I had students who actually made poems on campus with it.
I put the moon on my floor. There was like a space option. So I put the moon on my floor and it was spinning.
Transgressive.
That's pretty cool.
It was pretty cool. I mean, I like the moon just when it's in the sky. This was even better. It was on my floor. So I'm just going to read my outro really quick, if that's okay.
Please.
So if you liked what you heard tonight, our next edition of No Reservations will be with Dr. Eileen Cupit, who is an expert on death, dying, and grief, among other things, and whose talk is titled Grief Goes to Camp. That is scheduled for 6:30 on April 28th. You can access the No Reservations series at the Weidner Center's YouTube page and at causeeffect.org, and that's CAHSS effect.org. Julie and Chris, thanks for taking the time. I really enjoyed this. This is new territory for me, so thanks for helping me and everybody out in our augmented reality wade into it.
Thanks so much for having us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks.